There is a silent belief that many people carry through their entire lives without ever saying it out loud. The belief that somehow life is working against them. When plans fall apart, we take it as proof that we chose wrong. When someone leaves, we hear it as a verdict on our worth. When the same obstacle appears again and again, we quietly conclude that we were never meant to have the life we hoped for. And slowly, without noticing, we begin to shrink. We stop asking. We stop reaching. We move through our days braced for the next disappointment, as if life were an opponent studying our weaknesses. But Carl Jung looked at the human soul from a very different height. He believed that what happens to us is only half of the story. The other half, the deeper half, is the attitude with which we receive it. A person who assumes that life is against them will find evidence everywhere. But a person who begins to live with a quiet assumption that everything unfolding is somehow working for their becoming steps into the very same world and finds an entirely different life waiting there. In this video, we will explore one of the most quietly powerful ideas hidden inside Jung's philosophy. Act as if everything always works out, not as blind optimism, not as a denial of pain, but as a deliberate psychological posture that changes what you are able to see, what you dare to attempt, and ultimately, who you become. Stay until the end, because the 5 truths ahead are not motivational slogans. They are doorways, and one of them may be the very door you have been standing in front of for years without recognizing it. Most people move through their days believing that events are simply events. A delayed opportunity is just bad timing. A repeated conflict is just other people being difficult. A closed door is just a closed door. But from Carl Jung's point of view, this way of seeing is not neutral. It is a kind of deafness. Jung spent his entire life studying the way the deeper mind communicates, and what he found was strange and beautiful. The psyche does not speak in arguments. It speaks in patterns, in repetitions, in the situations that keep finding us no matter how many times we change cities, jobs, or relationships. He once wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." When many people first hear this sentence, they think Jung is talking about destiny. But his meaning runs deeper than that. He is saying that what we experience as random misfortune is very often a message we have refused to open. The same painful pattern returns not because life is cruel, but because something within us is still waiting to be understood. I remember a period in my own life when this became impossible to ignore. For almost 2 years, every project I started seemed to collapse at the same stage. Not at the beginning, when energy is high. Not at the end, when the finish line pulls you forward. Always in the middle. Always at the exact point where the work stopped being exciting and started demanding patience. For a long time, I blamed circumstances. A partner who lost interest. A market that shifted. A season that was simply unlucky. And each explanation felt reasonable on its own. But one quiet evening, looking back over those 2 years, I saw it clearly for the first time. The circumstances were different every time. The pattern was identical. The collapse always arrived at the moment the work asked me to keep going without applause. The problem had never been out there. Life had been repeating the same sentence to me, patiently, in different languages, waiting for me to finally listen. This is what Jung meant when he suggested that the events of our lives can be read the way we read a dream, not literally, but symbolically. The question is never only, what happened? The question is, what is this trying to show me about myself? Now, consider what changes when a person begins to live this way. When you believe life is random, every setback is meaningless pain. There is nothing to learn, only something to endure. But when you act as if everything is working for your growth, every setback becomes information. The failure is no longer a wall, it is a mirror. Not because the universe is a machine that rewards positive thinking, but because the assumption itself changes your behavior. A person who expects meaning searches for it. and a person who searches, finds. Think of it like standing in a vast library at night. The books are all there, thousands of them, holding everything you need. But if you believe the library is empty, you never light the lamp. The person who acts as if the answer exists is the only one who ever starts reading. The events of your life are that library. The repeated struggles, the strange coincidences, the doors that closed at the exact moment they did. None of it changes when you change your assumption. What changes is that you at last begin to read. And here is the quiet miracle hidden in this first truth. At the moment you start treating your life as communication rather than punishment, the fear begins to drain out of it. A message can be difficult, but a message is never your enemy. It arrived because something in you is ready to hear it. This happens far more often in everyday life than we realize. Someone keeps attracting the same kind of friendship, the kind that takes and calls it bad luck with people. But the pattern is asking why they only feel valuable when they are being used. Someone keeps abandoning things at the edge of success and calls it a lack of discipline. But the pattern is asking what they believe will be demanded of them if they finally succeed. Someone keeps choosing partners who cannot stay and calls it fate. But the pattern is asking whose love, long ago, taught them that closeness and disappointment are the same thing. In every case, the outer story changes and the inner sentence remains. And the person who never learns to listen will spend decades rearranging the surface of their life, changing cities, changing faces, changing jobs, while the one thing that actually needed to change travels with them, unopened, in the dark. So before we move on, let this question settle for a moment. What is the pattern that keeps returning to your life? Not the circumstances, the pattern beneath them. Because that pattern is not your curse. It may be the most honest letter life has ever written to you. And once a person begins to listen to their life, they inevitably encounter something uncomfortable. Because not all messages are gentle. Some of them point directly at the parts of ourselves we have spent years avoiding. Carl Jung gave this hidden territory a name. He called it the shadow. The shadow is everything we have pushed out of sight in order to remain acceptable. The anger we learned to swallow, the ambition we were told was arrogant, the sensitivity we buried because it once made us a target. None of it disappears. It simply moves into the dark, where it waits. Jung wrote, "What you resist not only persists, but will grow in size." Most people read this as a warning, but hidden inside it is a promise that almost everyone misses. If what you resist grows, then your resistance is a map. It shows you, with perfect accuracy, exactly where your unlived life is buried. Notice what disturbs you most in other people. The colleague whose confidence irritates you, the friend whose freedom makes you quietly resentful, the stranger whose boldness you call reckless. From Jung's perspective, these reactions are rarely about the other person. We are disturbed most by those who live out what we have forbidden in ourselves. There is a story from the life of the painter Henri Matisse that captures this with surprising force. Late in his life, Matisse was asked whether he believed in God. He answered, "Yes, when I work." For decades, Matisse had been a lawyer's clerk, living a careful, correct, colorless life. The turning point came during an illness, when his mother gave him a box of paints. He later said that from the moment he began to paint, he felt he had been handed a kind of paradise, and that some force he could not name had been dormant inside him his whole life. But here is the part of the story people forget. His father was ashamed. His teachers were dismissive. The respectable world he came from treated his turn toward art as a failure of character. Everything around him resisted it, because everything within him had resisted it first. The very thing he had suppressed for 20 years, the thing that felt most dangerous to admit, turned out to be the center of his existence. This is the strange law of the shadow. We do not fear our weakness nearly as much as we fear our greatness. Weakness asks nothing of us. But the buried strength, the unlived calling, the larger self hidden in the dark, That demands everything. It demands that we change, so the mind protects us from it. It disguises the calling as impossibility. It whispers that we are too old, too late, too ordinary. And we believe the whisper, because believing it lets us stay where it is safe. Now bring this back to the central idea of this video. What does it mean to act as if everything always works out when you are standing face to face with your own shadow? It means something very precise. It means treating even your darkest material as raw gold. The envy you feel is not proof that you are small. It is a compass pointing toward what you actually want. The anger you suppress is not proof that you are broken. It is energy that has never been given honest work to do. The grief you carry is not proof that life defeated you. It is the measure of how deeply you are capable of loving. Jung saw this process in the dreams of his patients again and again. When a person began to turn toward their shadow instead of running from it, the imagery of their dreams would change. The monster that had chased them for years would stop, turn around, and hold something out in its hands. A key, a lamp, a child. The very figure they had spent a lifetime fleeing was carrying the missing piece of who they were. The pursuit was never an attack. It was a delivery that could not be completed until they stopped running. Look honestly at your own life, and you may find the same strange mercy at work. The trait you have battled hardest is usually strength wearing the wrong clothes. The stubbornness you were criticized for as a child is the same iron that becomes perseverance when it finds a worthy task. The sensitivity you learned to hide is the same instrument that lets you feel what others miss, in people, in rooms, in your work. Nothing in the psyche is waste. There is only power that has been given a name that shames it. A person who acts as if everything works out does not sort their inner life into acceptable and unacceptable pieces. They assume that all of it, every last fragment, arrived for a reason and can be turned toward their becoming. Imagine a blacksmith standing before a pile of dark, twisted metal. To an ordinary eye, it is scrap, worthless, something to be hauled away and forgotten. But the blacksmith does not see scrap, he sees material. The same fire, applied with patience, turns what everyone else discarded into the strongest blade in the forge. Your shadow is that metal. Life did not give it to you as a burden. It gave it to you as material. Once a person understands this, a knot deep inside them begins to loosen. They stop being at war with themselves, because they realize that even the parts of their story they are most ashamed of were never evidence against them. They were the forge. Yet even when a person hears the call and faces their shadow, one great obstacle remains. It is perhaps the most common prison of the modern mind, the demand for certainty. Most people are waiting to feel ready, waiting for proof that the risk will succeed, waiting for a sign so unmistakable that no courage will be required at all. And while they wait, the years pass, one by one. Carl Jung understood something about human transformation that our culture has almost entirely forgotten. He wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." Notice the word he chose. Privilege, not guarantee, not plan. A privilege is something offered, and an offer must be accepted while it stands, never with full knowledge of how it will end. From Jung's perspective, the psyche does not develop through certainty. It develops through committed action taken in the presence of doubt. This is what he saw in every genuine transformation, in his patients and in himself. The decisive step is always taken before the person feels ready. Readiness is not the cause of the step. Readiness is its consequence. Modern neuroscience has arrived, by a completely different road, at a strikingly similar conclusion. Researchers studying motivation have found that the brain's sense of confidence is built largely from evidence of past action. The system does not ask how you feel, it asks what you have done. Each act of courage, however small, is recorded as proof of who you are, which means confidence cannot be manufactured in advance. It can only be earned in motion. The feeling follows the act, never the other way around. There is a story in the Hebrew scriptures that carries this truth in symbolic form. When the Israelites reached the Jordan River, the water did not part while they stood on the bank watching. The text is very specific. The river only parted when the feet of the priests actually touched the water. They had to step into the current while it was still flowing. The path did not appear for those who waited. It appeared for those already walking. At the psychological level, this is not a story about rivers. It is a story about how reality responds to commitment. The unlived path cannot reveal itself to a spectator. Something about you has to be different first. You have to be in the water. Think about how this plays out in an ordinary life. The person who wants to write does not need certainty that the book will succeed. They need one honest page, written today. The person trapped in the wrong career does not need a perfect 5-year plan. They need one conversation, one course, one small act of disloyalty to their own resignation. The person longing for deeper connection does not need a guarantee against heartbreak. They need to let themselves be seen, once, without armor. None of these steps require certainty. All of them require courage. And this is precisely where acting as if everything works out reveals its true power. Because notice what that inner posture actually does. It does not predict the future. It cannot. What it does is remove the paralyzing demand that the future be known before you move. The person who acts as if things work out is free to take the step, because they are no longer holding their own life hostage to a guarantee that was never coming. Picture two climbers at the base of the same mountain in the same fog. The first says, "I will not climb until the fog lifts and I can see the summit." He is still standing there. The second says, "I can see the next 10 meters, and that is enough." She is already halfway up. The mountain is identical. The fog is identical. The only difference is what each of them required before moving. Life almost never shows you the summit. It shows you the next stretch of road. Acting as if everything works out is simply the decision that the next stretch is enough. And there is one more thing that must be said about waiting, because the mind is clever in its avoidance. Waiting rarely announces itself as fear. It disguises itself as wisdom. It calls itself preparation, research, timing. It says, "I am not avoiding the step, I am simply being careful." And sometimes that is true. But there is a simple test that separates preparation from hiding. Preparation has an end date. Hiding does not. If you have been preparing for the same step for years, if the finish line of your readiness keeps moving the moment you approach it, then what you are doing is no longer preparation. It is a treaty you have signed with your own fear, renewed every morning. Jung believed that the psyche keeps an honest ledger of these treaties. Every time we betray the inner call in exchange for comfort, a part of us records it. This is why unlived life does not feel like peace. It feels like a low hum of guilt with no crime attached. The depression of many capable people, Jung observed, is not the presence of something wrong, but the absence of something essential. They are not sick, they are unlived. Before continuing, take a quiet moment, slow your breathing, and let your shoulders drop. Growth is not a race to be sprinted. It is a road to be walked with awareness, one honest step at a time. If something in this truth touches a decision you have been postponing, pause the video for a moment and be honest with yourself about what it is. And if you are willing, write one sentence in the comments. The step I have been waiting to take is this. Sometimes naming the step, plainly, in writing, is the first meter of the climb. As a person begins to walk their path with courage, sooner or later, life delivers the kind of blow that no attitude seems able to soften. The loss that cannot be reversed. The injustice that cannot be explained. The season of suffering that arrives without invitation and stays without mercy. It is here, in this darkest territory, that Jung's philosophy faces its hardest test. Because what can it possibly mean to act as if everything works out, when something has happened that clearly undeniably did not work out. Jung's answer is subtle, and it changes everything. He never claimed that all events are good. He claimed something far more radical, that human beings possess the capacity to forge meaning from any event. He wrote, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." Read that sentence slowly. It draws a line between two things our minds constantly confuse: the event and the self. What happened to you is a fact, fixed and unchangeable. But what you become in response to it never hardens into fact. It is a decision that remains open for as long as you live. History gave us an almost unbearable demonstration of this truth in the life of Viktor Frankl. A psychiatrist imprisoned in the concentration camps, Frankl lost his father, his mother, his brother, and his wife. He was stripped of his name, his work, and every external thing that had made him who he was. By any measure, life had not worked out, and yet, in the middle of that darkness, Frankl noticed something that would echo through the rest of the century. The prisoners who survived longest were not the strongest in body. They were the ones who held on to a meaning that suffering could not reach. A person to love, a work to finish, a truth to carry back to the world. Frankl himself survived, in part, by imagining a lecture hall in the future, where he would one day stand and teach others what the camps had revealed about the human spirit. He turned his agony into material for that future moment. He later wrote that everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. Notice what Frankl did not do. He did not pretend the suffering was good. He did not deny the horror. He performed a different act entirely, an act of inner alchemy. He allowed the event to remain evil while refusing to let it dictate what he became. This is the mature meaning of acting as if everything works out. It is not a claim about events. It is a claim about you. It says, whatever happens, I will be the kind of person who turns it into depth, into compassion, into strength. The working out does not happen in the world. It happens in the soul. There is an old Japanese art form that expresses this more honestly than any argument. It is called kintsugi. When a precious bowl breaks, the artisan does not hide the damage or throw the bowl away. He repairs the cracks with lacquer mixed with powdered gold. The break becomes a golden river across the surface. The bowl is not restored to what it was. It becomes something it could never have been without breaking, and it is valued more highly than before. The philosophy beneath kintsugi is quietly devastating to our usual way of thinking. We assume our task is to remain unbroken, and that every crack diminishes us. But the deepest human beings you have ever met were not unbroken people. They were people whose breaks had been filled with gold. Their patience was forged in years that did not work out. Their kindness was forged in humiliations that did not work out. Their wisdom was forged in losses that will never, in any ordinary sense, be redeemed. Their gold was never in the event. It was in what they did with it. Modern psychology has since given this phenomenon a name. Researchers who studied survivors of profound loss expected to find only damage, and in many cases, damage was there. But in a remarkable number of lives, they found something else growing beside it, something they eventually called post-traumatic growth, deeper relationships, a changed sense of what matters, a strength that the person themselves could not explain. The research did not show that suffering is good. It showed that human beings contain a capacity that activates only under pressure, the way certain seeds open only in fire. The event breaks the shell. What grows afterward was inside all along. Here is what all of this reveals about the posture this entire video is describing. When you act as if everything works out, you are not making a prediction that could be proven wrong. You are making a commitment that cannot be. You are declaring, in advance, that whatever life delivers will be met by a self that transforms it. The event remains outside your control. The alchemy never was. So if you are carrying something right now that did not work out, Hear this truth gently. No one is asking you to call it good. You are only being invited to ask one question. What could this break make possible in me that an unbroken life never could? That question is the lacquer. What you pour into it is the gold. And now we arrive at the deepest layer of this philosophy, the truth toward which the other four have been quietly leading. For most of life, we operate from a small command center in the mind. Jung called it the ego. It plans, calculates, defends, and worries. It believes, sincerely, that it is running everything. And it is precisely this belief that exhausts us. Because the ego is trying to do a job it was never designed for. It is trying to control life. But Jung's decades of work led him to a discovery that he considered the most important of his career. The ego is not the whole of the psyche. It is a small island in a vast ocean. Beneath it lies what he called the self, with a capital S. A larger, older, wiser center of the personality that is constantly working toward our wholeness, the way a seed works toward the tree it already contains. In his writings, the self is the archetype of wholeness, and that the deepest purpose of a human life, the process he named individuation, is the gradual surrender of the ego's tyranny to this larger center. Not the destruction of the ego, its right-sizing. The ego stops pretending to be the author of the story and takes its true place as a character within it. Near the end of his life, when Jung was asked in a filmed interview whether he believed in God, the old man paused, smiled slightly, and gave an answer that startled the world. I don't need to believe, I know. Whatever one makes of his words, what he pointed toward was this lived experience, after 8 decades of inner work, that something in the depths was trustworthy, that the psyche was not chaos, that it had a direction. This is the final and most complete meaning of acting as if everything always works out. It is not a trick of positive thinking performed by the ego. It is the ego's honest admission that it was never alone. Consider how this looks in an ordinary life. A woman loses the job she fought for years to get. The ego experiences pure catastrophe. But something deeper in her, a place she cannot yet name, feels an almost shameful flicker of relief. 2 years later, standing in the middle of a life she could never have planned, she says the sentence that countless people have said while looking backward. Losing that job was the best thing that ever happened to me. Now ask the uncomfortable question, was she simply lucky? Or was the relief she felt on the first day already a signal from a deeper center that knew what the ego did not, that the life she was grieving had never truly been hers? Seen through Jung's eyes, these moments reveal the collaboration that was there all along, the dreams that warned us, the exhaustion that would not lift no matter how much we rested. Because the soul had already left a life the ego refused to leave. The strange pull toward a person, a place, a book, that made no sense at the time and turned out to be a hinge on which everything swung. We are not the sole authors of our lives. We are in dialogue. And trust is the willingness to hold up our end of the conversation. Picture a sailor on the open sea. He does not command the wind, and he never will. A foolish sailor curses this, rowing against the weather until his strength gives out. But the wise sailor learned long ago that his power was never in controlling the wind. It is in the set of his sails. He reads the currents, he adjusts, he cooperates, and through that cooperation, using forces vastly larger than himself, he crosses oceans that no amount of rowing could ever cross. Acting as if everything works out is the set of the sails. It is not passivity. The sailor still works, still watches, still chooses, and it is not control. The sea remains the sea. It is the third way that the ego, left to itself, can never find: participation. When a person finally begins to live from this place, the change is unmistakable. The grip loosens. The exhausting vigilance softens, not because life has become safe, but because they are no longer carrying it alone. They begin to treat the unplanned as input rather than interruption. They hold their plans firmly enough to act and lightly enough to be redirected. Jung had a word for the outer face of this collaboration. He called it synchronicity, the meaningful coincidence, the book that falls open to the exact page, the stranger on a train who says the one sentence you needed to hear, the call that arrives the very week you let go at last. The rational mind dismisses these moments, and it is free to. But Jung noticed something the rational mind cannot explain away. Synchronicities cluster around thresholds. They multiply precisely when a person stands in the middle of genuine transformation, as if the inner crossing and the outer world were not as separate as we were taught. He never asked his patients to believe this. He asked them only to notice. And those who noticed began to move through life differently, less like strangers in a mechanical universe, more like guests in a story that was somehow aware of them. You do not need to accept any metaphysics to receive the practical gift of this. Simply live for 1 month as if your life were meaningful, as if the events in it were addressed to you, and observe what happens to your attention, your courage, and your peace. That experiment costs nothing, and no one who has sincerely run it has ever reported back that they became smaller. And strangely, beautifully, it is exactly then that life seems to begin cooperating. Doors open that effort alone could never force. Not because the universe changed its behavior, but because a person who has stopped clenching can finally see the doors and walk through them. As this journey comes to its close, look back for a moment at the road we have walked. Life is not happening to you, it is speaking to you. What you resist is pointing at what you must become. Courage, not certainty, is the price of the path. Meaning is not found in events, but forged from them. And beneath all of it, something larger than the ego is working toward your wholeness, waiting only for your trust. Act as if everything always works out. You can see now that this was never a promise about circumstances. It is a way of standing in the world, a posture of the soul that turns messages into meaning, wounds into gold, and fear into the next 10 meters of the climb. Carl Jung never promised that life would be painless. He promised something far greater, that there is no experience, however dark, that cannot be woven into the fabric of your becoming, and that the person capable of that weaving is already within you, and always has been. Perhaps the most beautiful thing about this philosophy is how quietly it works. Nothing dramatic is required of you. You do not need to announce a new life, burn the old one down, or wait for a perfect beginning. The shift Jung described happens in moments so small that no one around you will even notice them at first. The moment you ask what a frustration is trying to teach you instead of who is to blame for it. The moment you take one step into the fog instead of demanding to see the summit. The moment you look at an old wound and for the first time ask what gold might fill it. Each of these moments seems weightless on its own, but repeated day after day, they change the entire trajectory of a life, the way a ship's course, altered by a single degree, arrives at a different continent. So tomorrow morning, when life presents you with its first small difficulty, try the experiment. Just once. Meet it with the quiet assumption that it arrived for your growth. Watch what changes, not in the world, in you. If this video touched something true in you, press like and subscribe to the channel, so we can continue walking the depths of the human mind together, through the eyes of Carl Jung. And leave a comment with the one truth, of the 5, that felt like it was written for your life. Because the truth that unsettles you most is rarely a coincidence. It is usually the door. And behind that door is not a different life. It is the same life, finally seen through the eyes of someone who has decided to trust it. Someone who walks forward, not because the road is certain, but because they have become certain of themselves. That person is not far away. You meet them the very moment you begin to act as if everything always works out.